It started with a phone call that nobody expected, a conversation that would change everything for 50 families in Manchester who were struggling to keep roofs over their heads as the economic crisis deepened and winter approached with its merciless cold. Maria Santos had been staring at the eviction notice for 3 days straight, the red letters blurring through her tears as she tried to explain to her two young children why they might have to leave their small apartment, the only home they had ever known. She worked double shifts at the hospital as a cleaner, her hands raw from disinfectant and her back aching from bending over endless floors. But it still wasn't enough to cover the rent that had increased again, just as her hours were cut. Down the hall, Ahmed Hassan sat in his wheelchair looking at the same notice, his disability benefits barely covering his medication, let alone the monthly payment that seemed to grow larger each month while his income stayed frozen in time. The building was full of stories like theirs, immigrant families who had come seeking better lives, elderly pensioners whose savings had evaporated, young parents working multiple jobs but still falling behind as prices soared and opportunities vanished like morning mist. The property management company had been relentless, sending letter after letter, making phone calls that started polite but grew increasingly threatening, until finally the eviction notices appeared under doors like harbingers of doom. 50 families in total, all living in the same complex of modest apartments that had become too expensive for the people who had called it home for years. Children walked to school with worried faces, sensing the tension in their parents' voices, even when they tried to hide their fears behind forced smiles and promises that everything would be all right. Maria's daughter Isabella had stopped asking for new school supplies, somehow understanding at age 7 that money was tight, and that maybe this year she would have to make do with her older brother's hand-me-down notebooks and pencils worn down to stubs. It was a Tuesday morning when the first call came. The property manager answering his phone expecting another complaint or plea for more time, but instead hearing a voice he didn't recognize speaking with quiet authority about arrangements that needed to be made. The caller identified himself only as a representative and explained that a private benefactor wished to settle the outstanding rent for all 50 families in the complex, not just for 1 month but for the next 6 months, enough time for people to get back on their feet or find alternative arrangements without the pressure of homelessness hanging over their heads like a sword. The property manager, skeptical at first, insisted on verification and proof of funds, certain this was some kind of elaborate hoax or scam. But within hours, the money had been transferred, more than £200,000 appearing in the company's account with a simple note that the identities of both the benefactor and the families were to remain completely confidential. When Maria received the call telling her that her family's rent had been paid, she thought it was a cruel joke, someone making fun of her desperation, and she hung up the phone with shaking hands. But the caller persisted, reaching out to the property management office directly and arranging for her to receive written confirmation that her account was current and that she had nothing to worry about for the next half year. Ahmed wheeled himself to the office that same afternoon, his voice trembling as he asked if it was really true, if somehow a miracle had occurred in his small corner of the world where miracles seemed to have forgotten his address. The staff, still processing the unprecedented situation themselves, could only confirm that yes, it was real, and yes, his family was safe. The news spread through the building like wildfire, families knocking on each other's doors with tears of relief and disbelief, children running through the hallways with laughter that hadn't been heard in months as the weight of fear lifted from their small shoulders. Mrs. Chen, 82 years old and living alone on a pension that barely covered her medication, sat in her kitchen and wept openly for the first time since her husband's death, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude that someone, somewhere, had seen her struggle and cared enough to act. The Pakistani family on the 3rd floor, who had been preparing to split up and send their children to relatives in different cities, could finally breathe again. Their teenage son no longer having to choose between staying in school or finding a job to help pay the bills. but the mystery of their benefactor consumed everyone's thoughts, whispers and theories spreading through the community as people tried to understand who could have such resources and such heart. Some suspected a wealthy businessman with connections to the area. Others wondered if it might be a charity organization working in secret. And a few cynics worried that there might be strings attached, that eventually someone would come demanding favors or recognition. The property management company had been instructed to maintain absolute confidentiality, revealing only that the payment had come from a legal representative acting on behalf of a client who wished to remain anonymous, someone who had specifically requested that no media attention or public acknowledgement should result from their actions. Days passed, then weeks, and still the families found themselves looking over their shoulders, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to knock on their doors and explain what was expected in return for this unprecedented generosity. Maria found herself working her shifts with a lightness she hadn't felt in years, actually humming while she cleaned the hospital corridors, her mind free to think about her children's future, instead of constantly calculating how many days they had left before eviction. Ahmed started attending physiotherapy sessions again, no longer canceling appointments because he couldn't afford the transportation, his spirits lifting as his body grew stronger and his hope for independence returned. It was Isabella, Maria's 7-year-old daughter, who first spotted the black Mercedes parked outside their building one evening in December, its windows tinted dark against the winter cold. She was walking home from school with her mother when she noticed the car and pointed it out, mentioning that she had seen the same vehicle several times over the past week, always in the evening, always with someone sitting quietly inside. Maria paid little attention at first, her mind occupied with planning a modest Christmas for her children now that the crushing weight of rent payments had been lifted from their shoulders. But she began to notice the car too, a presence that seemed both mysterious and somehow comforting. The revelation came not through any dramatic announcement or media revelation, but through a series of small coincidences that eventually painted a picture none of them had dared to imagine. A delivery driver mentioned seeing Cristiano Ronaldo's distinctive profile in the back seat of a Mercedes outside the building, but his story was dismissed as the imagination of a football-obsessed young man looking for his 15 minutes of fame. A neighbor claimed to have glimpsed the famous footballer walking through the lobby late one evening, but she was known for her love of gossip and her tendency to embellish stories, so her account was met with skeptical smiles and gentle dismissal. It was Ahmed who finally confirmed what had seemed impossible, his wheelchair positioned by his window giving him a perfect view of the street below, his insomnia ensuring he was awake during the late hours when the Mercedes would arrive. He had been a lifelong Manchester United fan, had watched every match from his hospital bed during his long recovery, had memorized every detail of his heroes' faces and movements, and when he saw Ronaldo step out of the car and look up at the building with an expression of quiet satisfaction, there was no doubt in his mind about who their anonymous benefactor had been all along. The knowledge spread through the building like a gentle wave, not the tsunami of excitement one might expect, but something deeper and more profound, a recognition that one of the world's most famous athletes had chosen to help them, not for publicity or tax benefits or any form of recognition, but simply because they needed help and he had the means to provide it. The children processed the information differently than their parents, some disbelieving that someone so famous would care about their ordinary lives, others accepting it with the matter-of-fact resilience that children possess when confronted with adult complexities they don't fully understand. Maria found herself crying in her kitchen again, but these were different tears, tears of a mother who had watched her children go to bed hungry and wake up afraid, who had felt the shame of needing help and the pride that made asking for it almost impossible, and who now understood that help could come from the most unexpected places without judgment or conditions. She tried to imagine what had motivated Ronaldo to drive through Manchester's working-class neighborhoods, to notice their building among thousands of others, to somehow learn about their struggles and decide to act. And she found herself overwhelmed by the simple human kindness of someone who could have chosen to look away, but chose instead to see and to care. Ahmed wheeled himself to his window each evening, hoping to catch another glimpse of the man who had saved his family from homelessness, wanting somehow to express his gratitude, even though he knew that anonymity had been the point all along. He found himself watching Ronaldo's matches with new eyes, seeing not just the athletic prowess and competitive fire that had made him a global icon, but the humanity that existed beneath the celebrity, the heart that had recognized their pain and moved to alleviate it without fanfare or expectation of return. The Christmas that year was unlike any the building had experienced in recent memory. Families gathering in the common areas to share meals and stories, children playing in hallways that had previously echoed with worry and whispered fears, elderly residents joining in conversations about hope and second chances, instead of sitting alone with their concerns about the future. Mrs. Chen brought homemade dumplings to share with her neighbors, her savings account no longer depleted by rent payments, allowing her to buy ingredients for the recipes her late husband had loved. Her kitchen filled with familiar smells and the laughter of children who had adopted her as an honorary grandmother. The Pakistani family's teenage son, Hassan, returned to his studies with renewed focus, his dreams of becoming an engineer no longer seeming impossibly out of reach now that his family's basic needs were secure. His younger sister started taking piano lessons at school, her musical talents finally having room to flourish without the constant pressure of financial crisis weighing down every household decision. Their parents found themselves sleeping through the night for the first time in months, their bodies finally able to rest without the adrenaline of desperation keeping them alert to every sound that might herald another crisis. But perhaps the most profound change was in how the families looked at each other and themselves. The shared experience of unexpected rescue, creating bonds that went deeper than mere proximity or convenience. They began to organize community dinners and childcare cooperatives, their individual relief transforming into collective strength, as they realized that their struggles had been shared and their salvation had come through the recognition of their common humanity. The building transformed from a collection of desperate individuals into a genuine community, people who had been brought together by hardship and united by the generosity of someone who had seen them as worthy of help. It was in February, 3 months after the payments had been made, that Ronaldo made his only public appearance at the building, arriving not in the Mercedes but in a modest rental car, wearing jeans and a simple jacket that helped him blend in with the residents who had gathered in the community room for their weekly potluck dinner. He hadn't planned to reveal himself, but a scheduling conflict with his usual evening drives had brought him to the building during a time when the community was active and visible, their laughter and conversations spilling out into the courtyard where he sat in his car, watching the scene he had helped to create. Maria was the first to notice him through the window, her heart stopping as she recognized the profile that had become familiar from her daughter's bedroom posters and her son's football magazines. But it was her children who broke the spell of shocked silence by running outside and approaching the car with the fearless curiosity that only children possess. Isabella knocked gently on the passenger window, her small face pressed against the glass as she waved and smiled, and Hassan, her teenage brother, opened the door with the kind of respectful boldness that comes from desperation to express gratitude that has been building for months. What followed was not the chaotic scene of celebrity worship that might have been expected, but something quieter and more meaningful, a gathering of families who had been touched by an act of kindness that had changed their lives in ways that extended far beyond financial relief. Ronaldo found himself surrounded not by fans seeking autographs or selfies, but by parents wanting to thank him for allowing their children to sleep peacefully, by elderly residents whose eyes sparkled with tears of gratitude, by teenagers who had been given the gift of dreaming about their futures again without the crushing weight of immediate survival needs. Ahmed wheeled himself through the crowd, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch the arm of the man who had saved his family, his voice breaking as he tried to find words adequate to express what those 6 months of paid rent had meant to someone whose disability benefits barely covered his medication, let alone housing costs. Mrs. Chen approached with a container of her homemade dumplings, pressing them into Ronaldo's hands with the insistence of a grandmother who shows love through food, her broken English carrying more emotion than any fluent speech could have conveyed, as she repeated "thank you" over and over like a prayer. The Pakistani family's father, a proud man who had struggled with accepting help even when it was desperately needed, found himself embracing Ronaldo with tears streaming down his face, his dignity intact because the help had come without conditions or judgment, allowing him to maintain his sense of self-worth while providing his family with the security they needed to rebuild their lives. His wife, normally shy around strangers, especially famous ones, spoke eloquently about how the gift of stable housing had allowed her to focus on her children's education instead of constantly worrying about where they would live next month. But it was the children who provided the most honest reactions, their innocence cutting through any adult complications or awkwardness as they simply expressed their happiness at meeting someone who had helped their families. Isabella presented Ronaldo with a drawing she had made of a soccer ball surrounded by hearts, her 7-year-old artistic skills creating something that touched him more deeply than any professional artwork ever could. Hassan, her brother, spoke about how he had been able to concentrate on his studies again, how his grades had improved once the constant fear of homelessness had been removed from his daily concerns. The evening stretched on longer than anyone had expected, Ronaldo finding himself genuinely moved by the stories he heard, by the impact his actions had created in ways he had never anticipated when he first learned about the building's plight through a charitable organization that had reached out to his management team. He had expected to feel satisfaction at helping people in need, but he hadn't prepared for the emotional weight of seeing the actual faces of the families he had assisted, of understanding the ripple effects that extended far beyond simple rent payments. When he finally prepared to leave, the crowd gathered around his car wasn't asking for anything more than they had already received, their gratitude expressed not through demands for future help or attempts to leverage their connection with him, but through simple human acknowledgement of a kindness that had restored their faith in the possibility of unexpected good in a world that had seemed increasingly harsh and unforgiving. Maria pressed a letter into his hands, written in careful English with help from her teenage son, expressing not just her family's gratitude, but her promise to remember this lesson in generosity and to pass it forward when her circumstances allowed. The Mercedes drove away that night, carrying more than just a famous footballer, returning to his luxurious life, but a man who had been reminded of the power that comes with great resources when they are used to address real human need without expectation of recognition or return. The 50 families settled into their beds that night, knowing that their benefactor had seen them not as charity cases or publicity opportunities, but as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and security. And that knowledge changed not just their living situations, but their understanding of their own worth in the world. In the months that followed, as the families worked to stabilize their finances and rebuild their lives, the story of Ronaldo's generosity spread quietly through Manchester's working-class communities, not as gossip or celebrity news, but as proof that kindness could come from the most unexpected sources, and that famous people could choose to use their influence for genuine good rather than personal gain. The building became known in the neighborhood not as a place of desperation, but as a symbol of hope, evidence that sometimes help arrives precisely when it is most needed, and from directions no one could have predicted. Years later, when Isabella had grown into a teenager, and Hassan had earned his engineering degree, when Ahmed had regained much of his mobility, and Mrs. Chen had celebrated her 90th birthday surrounded by the community that had become her chosen family, they would still speak of that winter when a stranger's kindness had changed everything. Not just providing temporary relief, but demonstrating that their lives mattered to someone who had never met them, but recognized their humanity and chose to act on that recognition in the most direct and meaningful way possible.